Okay, I'm sure we have a lot of questions and comments, so just open the floor, please.
We have to speak into this, I think, as well.
Oh, both of us?
Because they're recording us.
Yeah.
In global pharma, in recent years, countries which used to provide genetic materials for pharma to be produced and sold very expensively. In other places, some of these countries now organize their own pharma companies. Cuba is a case in point, South Africa as well. So I was wondering whether with urine and pharma you have somewhat parallel phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely. This was the case with Israel, with Ecopharm. It was a local pharmaceutical companies that then became a part of a larger network, in that specific case with the Italian pharmaceuticals. So, Serono, I also know, as I mentioned this name, Sanda Beruta, who did work on the 1970s and 80s India for pregnancy urine collection campaigns, and there it was also, so these companies are, that story also contained an emergence of local pharmaceutical companies, but they were never independent. So they were a part of a bigger scheme of...
Which is different from Cuba and South Africa, where they developed independent ones.
Okay.
Do you see any new trends? Thank you. Do you see any new trends, current trends, in face of climate change, in our attitude to natural material, organic material, as opposed to a very technocratic attitude to solving the crisis?
Sorry, could you repeat the last part?
Maybe I can ask. How do you see the maybe contradiction between nature-based attitudes and technocratic attitudes currently in face of climate change? Are these attitudes changing, or do you still see them going back to older attitudes, previous attitudes?
I don't know.
I have to speak into this, correct? I honestly, I see the technocratic as still being the dominant attitude here. While I'm talking here about a kind of a love of the synthetic, there's also a minor love of the organic, but that is still, the hegemony is still synthetic and technocratic. That said, the history of sensibility tells us that sensibilities can change, and can change relatively quickly. But I'm not necessarily sure by looking to the past we have any clue about how we might do that again, apart from working on our own sensibilities. That's my major recommendation, I suppose. Try to get over your own disgust. I'm not saying you have that. This doesn't work.
It works now. Okay. Chris, I'm nevertheless going to begin with some political economy.
All right.
All right. Because your hygienic self, who's to be found at the center of your new sensory order, was clearly an urban denizen, as you yourself acknowledged in referencing the, would you call it, the paved, concretized streets of the city, where it was very hard to get hold of enough soil in order to properly manage the system of toilets that you described to us. But in fact, because most of the defecation was being carried out in the city in order to properly kind of create this circuit, this proper circuit of ecological balance in which, in fact, we would use the material to fertilize, rejuvenate, in fact, if not even enhance the soil. We'd have to move it from the city to the country, in other words, around the continent, which kind of makes your low-tech, inexpensive toilet system not so low-tech and not so inexpensive for it to become a properly function in a network. So think about that. I'd be interested to know if there was actually any attempt. Now, we know that there are synthetic fertilizers being offered already by agricultural improvers by the late 1830s or so they'd have to...
Even, yeah, around that time.
Yeah, that's when it takes off, and that's when agricultural improvement becomes capitally intensive, because this stuff is expensive. I'm not sure creating a system of moving all the waste around the country, I don't know how much cheaper that would be. Anyway, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts. My only other comment or reference, now I'm going to shift to an economy of signs, which might more suit your odors. And that is thinking about water, and water's rather miraculous status in the civilizing process, particularly in the 19th century. And it's kind of funny that it's played a rather innocuous role in all of our conversations since yesterday. It's kind of, I said it's funny, it's actually surprising. So talk to us a little bit about water too. You put a graphic up on the screen for the Croton water, which is considered to be the key to at least Manhattan's 19th century growth, and in fact emergence as a world metropolis. Now they brought the water in not in order to use it in toilets. Of course, they brought the water in order to drink and to clean.
Right.
So, okay, I'll stop there.
With regards to your first question, most of there are some earth closet enthusiasts who insist it is possible to use it in an urban milieu that's designed to enable its immediate recycling. Cities don't have to develop without green areas, without gardens. But another flaw in the plan was the way that we talk about British, American, and many European cities were ultimately laid out and designed. So I think that there's no inevitability that urban form will follow that plan, even though ultimately it did. That said, quite a few of the earth closet enthusiasts said, actually, it's not going to work in urban areas. But this is a very useful technology for all small-scale settlements, which is still a significant percentage of the population back in the middle of the 19th century, and would still make an ecological difference. With regards to your second question, I think my only observation is something that I pointed out here, which is that it's interesting to note that there were 19th century voices who said we can have a sanitary revolution effectively without a lot of water, and that water is actually, as I noted and described, a treacherous medium. And the wrong medium through which this revolution should be carried out. But there is something about the valences of the elements, of the ancient elements here, water's priority over earth, and the need to sort of think about the symbolism of earth and the human relationship to earth, which is, again, beyond the ken of this talk and beyond my knowledge at present. But there's something going on about the calibration of water and earth here in the favor of water.
Let other people.
Thank you very much. This was really interesting.
A few questions about the whole concept of bio-value and how you integrate it into your thoughts. Addressed to both of you. The whole notion of the microbiome that is now rising so steeply, which may present a new version, a high-tech version, so to speak, of new usage of human waste, is, I think, another perspective to look at both your materials. And then there is another domain, the domain of reproductive medicine, wherein bio-value has been circulating and rising for quite a long time. People have been selling and buying human ova, sperm, wombs actually, breast milk. So in some, let alone organ transplantation, so there is, I think, very, very high and lucrative, so to speak, market of human organs and now waste that I think can beneficially be integrated to your historical perspective. Thank you.
So I would say I gave some examples about early sex endocrinology in which bodily parts were sought for. This is certainly not a new phenomenon. So I would say there's something, you're right, that there's something, there's certainly an issue of market here. It has become this category that captures a lot of how, well, of the appreciation of bodily material. What has happened, at least in the context that I know, 20s and 30s, bodily, well, urine became valued as and more or continued to be used, and not other bodily materials because it has this the substance itself is not risky, whereas, for example, when you use brains of corpses, that then transformed into brought itself the risk of disease infection or other issues that always come with the use of biological material, and then so urine has this special issue of being actually sterile. I would say. I had some. Okay, the question of bio-value in general, or just the questions of value, are really interesting. And when you talk about waste, always. But in this, in the specific issue of urines, is always interesting because almost everyone from these very different worlds of old practice using urines continuously use this phrase, turning urine into gold. So something about there's always a question about value already inhabited in this material that comes from uselessness. So this is indeed crucial.
And lots of the fertilizer literature that Frederick was discussing yesterday, but also is sort of percolating in the back of my paper. The exact same kind of almost alchemical language is used. We are producing gold from waste, maybe from industrial waste. So that's clearly there too. One other issue about value going on here, which relates to the history of science, is the relationship between this thinking about closed loops and endless recycling and the thermodynamic sciences that were formed around the same time. There is a kind of anti-entropic thrust to the logic of people who are discussing very, very local recycling. I mean, Moule argues that you can, by applying earth to dung, you keep bringing it up to a higher and higher fertilizing value every time, which is almost completely the opposite, the kind of entropic thinking that was beginning to develop in agricultural scientific circles. So there is this trend of anti-entropy going on here, which is an interesting thing to think about.
Okay. I think that it was 1906. In New York City, there was a big conference attended by mayors of almost all major cities in Western Europe to deal with the issue of horse manure.
Horse manure.
Horse manure, right. which was a...
Did you say horse manure?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes,
very good.
Which was a major... in a different sense. So getting rid of this was a major problem, and it was actually a larger issue. Okay, now it's much better. Thank you. Historian of science and technology. So So getting rid of that was a major issue, which was overturned in a matter of few years when the cars came in, and all of a sudden this was not a problem anymore, and human waste was much more an issue. Another thing is a question about the rising knowledge and interest in microbiology and bacteria studies and all sorts of things. How would that affect the use, the more environmental friendly and not water-based ways of getting rid of human excrement when they would realize that you put E. coli into fields and you do this or that, and that can create a major issue, not anymore being so clean microbiologically. Third is to combine two things that you did in the past about consumption of animals. So since you used the S word, so we can legitimize this. So any vegan person would tell you that there's enormous difference between vegan shit and omnivore shit. So at a certain point where the rise of consumption of animals occurred, I would expect that this would become much more of a problem because of the consistency, the level of contamination, and which is usually in vegan shits because of what's the word for there's more metabolism? No, not metabolism. Okay. It'll come back. The last thing is about unfortunately, a lot of these attitudes are mediated by religion. So historically, so the notion of purity and impurity and how water and fire cleanses is as ancient as you can think of human history. So I wouldn't say that water became such a major thing in the 18th or 19th centuries in order to purify something that was considered to be impure. But what I understand you to say is that it was not considered, that human excrement was not considered to be impure. Is this the, or maybe I'm wrong?
Shit is not impure.
Yeah.
No. The biblical language that, pretty much every treatise on an earth closet contains some kind of reference to everything that comes from the earth shall return to the earth, as some sort of reference to a kind of closed loop. That there is this kind of language in pretty much every text. And the premise here, very, very simply, is that earth, shit is perfectly pure and good, and water actually acts to depurify it because it dissipates and becomes sewage sludge. And sewage sludge was proved time and time again to be a relatively, not necessarily worthless, but not a particularly cost-effective or efficient way of fertilizing. So the pure excrement without water is returned entirely to the soil. That's that bit. If you want to come in on
I wanted to comment on.
Shits, or...
Yeah, I did, because actually there are differences between different types of urine as well. So I did talk about pregnancy urine, postmenopausal urine, but and how that translates into different uses for hormonal purposes. But actually, just for example, in Meiji, Japan, where urine with nitrile and urine was collected, there was a. So just to say, there's a nice match between. Use when something becomes useful, and then the different categories that come with it. So when urine is in use, there's also, and this is true for shit as well, so you would start having different categories. There's a mapping or catalog for different types of and what they're used for. So the ways in which urine is different, not just if it's horse urine or human urine or and so on, but also it translates. There's the question.
the lack of disgust leading you to your arguments about the sensorium. But the fact that something is in circulation, the fact of presence, doesn't mean that pre-modern shit doesn't stink, or that people, or piss, right? And that people might tolerate it because they don't have other choices. But the histories of wiping and their effects on bodily differentiation between left and right. So in pre-modern time, most people wipe with their left hand, giving rise to these practices of approaching a room with the Quran or with your right foot, or shaking your right hand and never reaching with your left one. Or even what we heard from Reut in the first panel about Tokugawa, Japan, very much along the lines, Tamar, of these differentiations within excrement, wherein higher class excrements are more valued, higher class and probably carnivore. Seems to indicate that disgust about the general category of excrement and feces does exist. So I'm just wondering if you're not romanticizing the past and conflating presence with sympathy.
Just hold on. Just to add to what On is saying, representing the earlier periods, the whole idea of Roman waste disposal is based on water. It's based on water. You're getting rid of water is culture, water is life, water is everything that is good. It's not just cleanliness, and you get rid of in the Cloaca Magna. I mean, people are doing it in all kinds of ways, but then everything is being taken away by streams of fresh water.
So, I was actually going to try and tackle this in the paper, and I didn't get round to it. I'm uncomfortable with the Mary Douglas model. As I'm sure many in this room are, I'm uncomfortable with the idea that anything can be disgusting, and anything can be pure according to cultural categories. I think James Gibson's idea of affordance is very, very useful. I mean, all material objects, all entities in the world have a range of affordances which we cannot deny. And the affordance of shit is that it smells, and it generally smells bad, and it generally smells bad to pretty much every culture on Earth. From the moment humans settled, they got rid of their shit. They did it at earliest settlements. That's what they do. So the idea that that everybody before happily tolerated this, and then suddenly it became enormously intolerable, is a cleavage that I think Corban emphasizes in his work. What I think happens is it's a much more marginal shift in tolerance. It's something that's tolerated but not enjoyed, and that becomes increasingly intolerable, and technology allows that chasm to widen, and the momentum generated by the technology and the sensibility widens and widens that chasm and makes the return increasingly tricky. So that's a far more, I think, satisfactory way of putting it than I put it in the paper. But certainly the idea of this big break, it becomes a bigger break than it was initially, and it's a slow process involving this process of momentum.
Yeah, I would say I agree. Indeed, it's a good question. It's a very important question to ask and to say. I mean, partially what I'm saying is that because 20th century includes these examples in sex endocrinology, so that use doesn't mean no discuss. So at least in late modernity, what it means. So in order to use weight, you have to create all these levels of separation in order for it to become much less urine looking. So you won't even know when you inject hormones to your body that they come from the urine of a horse in Canada, for example. But so this doesn't mean though that past practices had to enjoyed urine. But you can say, I mean, for example, if you look at the of Jan, the example, one of the first examples that I used, some people because they attribute some value to this material, they talk about so the elixir of life. They describe the practices with terms that have to do positive ones. So I wouldn't say it didn't, the urine didn't stink.
Thank you.
But when you think it would make, extend your life or make your sexual life more pleasurable or whatnot, this would make you enjoy it more or make it more tolerable. So in a sense, as I think what you're pointing to, it's a question of degree.
We don't have much more time, so we'll take two more questions left, please.
I have one question for Chris and one for Tamar. Very quickly, Chris, what if you add my protagonists to your talk? And then to Tamar, I was wondering about the use of the word donation, because you're
Donation.
where does
Yeah.
There's a difference between blood donation, sperm donation, urine donation, and egg donation, right? One would be something you'd throw away anyway, and the other, another would be a medical procedure. So I would like to hear your thoughts.
So shall I go first? I think what I'm saying here and what you were saying earlier on overlap pretty much perfectly. We're both arguing for that in common with a lot of literature, that a subtle set of transformations in the sensoria predates and are not determined by changes in medical epistemology in the later 19th century. That said, your protagonists, as it were, once we locate the fly, for example, as being the source of, or the vector of infantile diarrhea, as it was established via the horse manure and so forth, then this makes those domestic sanitary practices all the more intense. And again, back to using this word momentum, which I use all the time, the momentum of that culturally and practically continues long after the actual threat has gone. Therefore, the appearance of an insect in my house is a major event. An event which gets the children excited, which gets the dog excited, which has to be photographed and chronicled, and the offending bug has to be removed from the house. Nothing to do with the threat of disease. Matter out of place maybe captures that, but everything to do with a profound sense of bodily discomfort that comes from that bug.
So for the question of donations, I think it's particularly relevant when you talk in the context of the sort of the scheme of capitalist economy and the idea of individual human rights. So oftentimes in the sex endocrinology realm, they would talk about donation and donating urine as a way to sort of justify the practice of mass collections. But pretty early on, there's a realization that donation comes with money. So it's never donation, it would always come with compensation, just for with that example of UNRWA that I had before. I was trying to locate evidence about what donating means. So, and I would say practically the only one I have is from that watermelon case, in which well, allegedly it comes from a newspaper report from Israel about women who happily gave their urine for fighting the national enemy of infertility. But then there were some questions about whether it's authentic or not. And so these women were saying in the article, we're happily to donate our urine. We can't use our hormones anymore in a way, so we're happy to give it to women who are able to make new babies, and will actually will happily do the bris in the elderly home if possible. That would make us so very happy, and then please give us watermelons. But some investigation later on led me think that it's pretty much fake. I contacted the journalist who said that she doesn't remember any interviews with donors and anything like this. So I would say it's mostly used as a propaganda for the whole project. So it's actually quite impossible. It's really difficult to study urine anyway, and it's transparent also in the archive and for all these levels of separation and concealing I described before, but also because it's really, you don't know where it's coming from. Of course, the question of donation is not relevant for horses, but even in the case of women, I would highly suspect that there's from times of Leibniz, it's all about coercion. It comes from military barracks, from hospitals, well, for pregnant women. It comes from elderly homes with people who don't necessarily have the means to consent. I don't know that really.
Okay, so before we thank Chris and Tamar for this really wonderful panel, a look into the concluding panel, which will convene at 4:30. What we want to do is open up a conversation and try to draw initial conclusions from these 2 days of discussions. And what On and I were doing as kind of organizer curators throughout these 2 days is to think about the questions that are rising here from the different presentations. And what I would like to do now in 5 minutes is to present some of these questions, at least our questions. Of course, there are many others that you can come up with, as a kind of teaser or as an invitation to all of you to join us in this final panel, and to also give you some time to think about these things when we drink coffee or whatever you want to drink. So some of the questions have to do with the more historically, let's say, professional, with the discipline. Within the discipline, some of the questions have to do with historians' role in the public sphere, all in the shade of this environmental crisis. So without any particular order, I'll present some of these questions. When we started looking for roads not taken, knowledge forgotten or marginalized, we found them quite easily. From Professor Corey's presentation right at the beginning of this workshop and throughout the workshop, we saw that concern about environmental ruin and alternative knowledge or positions or technologies were there throughout the period we were covering in this workshop. So one entry point to more specific historical research is to ask, why did this knowledge, these institutions, this planning remain marginal? What kept them from becoming mainstream? This directs us to decision-making processes, positions in committees, governmental apparatus, in positions in academic departments, and so on. It may also direct us to big explanations with which we opened this workshop, like capitalism. So where do we find, for example, capitalism? But then already, as already observed, we have the Soviet world in which things were not fundamentally different. I mean, these alternative models and were not adopted there either. And thinking about these things more in a more historically concrete terms, is it possible that our pointing of culprits, that by pointing fingers we are projecting from the present to the past? Is it possible that agents of ruin today are different than the ones in the past? Okay, so this is a question of more directs to more specific historical research. Other questions, briefly, I'll try. What are, more broadly, the most pressing questions for historians to address, given that the impact of environmental crisis will increase over the coming years? How would each of us define an appropriate research agenda for the field? Surely this agenda may differ between historians working on different periods and geographical areas. Another question is, well, if adopting the same basic assumption about the intensification of the crisis in the coming years, what is the role of historians, not only within the field, but in the public sphere? Where are we most needed, if at all? And what can we add to the discussion? What makes global warming global from each of our research, our own perspective? What does this mean about the usual divisions of academic labor within the history department and within the university at large? What would be a fruitful configuration of interdisciplinarity from your perspective? We've identified several fault lines between a horizon of liberal democracy and that of Pax Americana or authoritarianism, solutions within and outside capitalism, and the interface of climate change research with other research agendas pertaining to other forms of global inequality. How should historians straddle these divides? Where do you stand in the tension we have identified between creating big narratives that are much more effective for public interventions and detailed, focused, and complex analysis? That is what we aspire to produce professionally. Historians like to say, well, it's complicated, but is it not the case that this complexity undermines action? We could, of course, stick to the same old protocols and produce those detailed and complex little histories and hope that time will bring larger synthesis. But is not time what we are lacking most? Maybe our methodologies, research protocols, and professional ethos is at odds with the urgency of the mission at hand. And finally, along these very general lines, how should academic publications in this field look like? Would collaborating in a road not taken popular science rather than academic, strictly academic volume would be attractive to you personally, and of course more generally? Is this something we should engage more in? Popular discourse and public sphere rather than our own niche. So that's a few questions for the next discussion. We'll reconvene at 4:30. So thank you very much for joining us again. Thank you.